2, 1. Yes, we're recording. Okay. We left off at a very important subject, corporal punishment, which again is something Mary and I have devoted tons of time studying. I can find where I am. Okay. If you think about corporal punishment in the Bible, what are the scriptures parents seem to know? That's right. You can find the most atheistic, pagan parent, somehow they know this scripture. They might not know where to find it or exactly what it says, but they all do the spare the rod, spoil the child. In Proverbs 22:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. So a few things come to mind here. One is that most people misquote this, or they quote it and then they ignore counter commands like Colossians 3:21, fathers, do not embitter your children or they'll become discouraged. Now, funny how guys who know this scripture have never heard of that scripture. Or Ephesians 6, fathers, do not exasperate your children, we've talked about before. The point is, these scriptures tell us that punishment, corporal punishment, there's a place for it, but we've got to be careful to watch ourselves, temper our punishments, and make sure the punishments fit the crime. That's why there are all those counter scriptures that seem to be ignored by a lot. So parents misapply the rod scriptures by using them to justify what? Their own impulsive, angry behaviors, right? They don't remember that fathers don't embitter your kids. Or, like I said before, they use corporal punishment to make their lives more convenient, not to teach or to train or build a relationship. They use corporal punishment to get the house quieter or to get the house cleaned up. They don't counter it with praise and encouragement and training. Does that make sense? Now, it can also be argued that the term rod, and Glenn could probably talk about this more than I can, the rod wasn't always a tool of beating, among shepherds. If I understand it correctly, the rod was also used to guide sheep and to count sheep, not always to beat the sheep. So we misunderstand the term rod, right? So once again, fathers especially will either misquote that or they forget the counterbalancing scriptures or they misinterpret what a rod was used for. In fact, corporal punishment, we'll go ahead and say this now, isn't for every kid. There are some kids where corporal punishment is actually contraindicated, like kids on the autism spectrum. A lot of time that's the worst thing you can do. It's throwing gas on a fire. We teach other classes about what to do with them. But then, lastly, the thing you have to be cautious about, as Mary will explain, some places have outlawed the practice. Some countries have outlawed corporal punishment, so this is a moot topic in some nations. But let's talk about some current research. Most people think that somehow the research has shown that corporal punishment is harmful to kids. Most people think that, or that it's proven to be harmful to kids. Let me tell you, we have studied this research for years ad infinitum. The research is far from conclusive about that. And what they consider corporal punishment, none of us would think of. They're talking about beating and abusive behavior. We're talking about using corporal punishment to train, to teach within biblical standards. So the research is far from conclusive, and there's a long-standing debate about whether or not corporal punishment is harmful. However, look at this. A couple of research papers. This guy, Lazarly, did a research and found out that not one of 17 causally relevant studies found predominantly detrimental outcomes for spanking if they did anything to rule out parents who used physical punishment too severely. In other words, if you take away the abusers and the irrational or extreme physical punishments, there's nothing to support that spanking is harmful. Here's another one. Sweden actually outlawed spanking in '79, thinking it would reduce instances of child abuse and teen violence, and in fact, the opposite has occurred. So since that ban, reports of serious child abuse has increased fourfold, and teenage violence has increased sixfold. So there's a piece of since the ban, not banned, so there's a piece of literature. So in the research, The issues appear to be not whether you use spanking or a punishment, spanking as a punishment, but the relational context in which spanking occurs. Does that make sense? So spanking isn't the issue. The issue is the context, the relational context in which spanking occurs. How often they occur, and whether or not the punishments include physical abuse or not. So, to summarize, corporal punishment isn't even a choice in some places, but it is in others. Now, when it is permissible, we believe that it's a good choice for a couple of reasons, things we know about psychological science. Number one, it's immediate. We learned as graduate students in psychology that if you want to influence a behavior, the reward or the punishment, the closer it follows the behavior, the more effective it is. Spanking, corporal punishment can happen right there. It can happen right there. It's not a wait till your father gets home. It's not a, you see what I'm saying? It can be immediate. And number two, it's impactful. The research has always shown that the more impactful, the more the organism has to lose by the punishment, the more effective it will be. So spanking, when done correctly, is impactful and it's immediate. Therefore, it's in accord with good psychological science. Now, when this is a good choice and you live in a country where it's permitted, we like to use what we call, and I think we invented this, but I'm not sure, it's been so long, the 3D approach to corporal punishment. This is how it works. Mary and I tell parents in our office there are 3 things for little kids that should always get a spanking. We've narrowed it down to the 3 Ds: disobedience, disrespect, and dangerous behavior. Now, here's how you do it. The first thing you have to do is explain to the child what these 3 things are. And they may be too young to even say the word, but they can still learn what it is. So on a good day, here's how we do it. On a good day, when no one's mad at anyone, no one's getting in trouble for anything, you take the child in hand and you say, honey, there's some things going on in this house that have to stop. One of them is disobedience. Do you know what disobedience means? No, I'm just a kid. Disobedience, you have to operationally define it. Disobedience is when you don't do what we tell you to the first time. Mary and I are big believers in the no 1, 2, 3 thing. You know, there's a lot of systems of punishment that say you get 3 chances. In my opinion, in my experience, that just teaches your child he has 1 and 2 to disobey until you get to 3, and then he knows you mean business. So disobedience means not doing what we tell you to do the first time. How about disrespect? Do you know what that is? No. Disrespect's kind of a tailorable, you can tailor it to the child. You know, when I tell you to do something, you give me that face. You know that face. Or when you stomp your foot, that's disrespect. You know when you call your sister that name, that's disrespect. You know when so you can tailor this to the child. You know what disrespect is, but you have to define it specifically for that child. How about dangerous behavior? You know what that is? No. It's whenever you do something that'll hurt yourself or somebody else. When you push your sister off her skateboard, you jump off the furniture, you get into dad's power tools, you touch the stove while I'm cooking, millions of examples. Now, every time you do one of these 3 Ds, you're going to get a spanking. Let's talk about that a little bit. Mary and I believe that the hand is not a good thing to spank with for a number of reasons. One, you don't want to condition the child to your hand, where every time you reach out, your kid thinks he's going to get beat. You're just shaking my hand or hugging me, you know. So we believe in using an implement. For another reason, this kid can transfer his hatred onto that implement all he wants and see it as something different from you. In fact, when our kids were little, we tried to personalize this implement. We had spanked with bolo paddles, you know, those badoink, kadoink, kadoink. We tried some ping pong paddles. Those weren't really working out. So we decided one day to all go shopping. So we went to a toy store looking for a spanker. Now it was a day when we were all happy, no one was in trouble. So we employed the children. Let's look for a spanker. So we went out shopping. Went to a toy store, and we found this game, some beach game, a paddle beach game, where you take a little ball and you get on the beach and you do the ball back and forth. Now, I looked at this implement, and it had many favorable characteristics. One, it was pretty tough. It was plywood. Two, it had this cool graphic on it of some, like an African hieroglyphic symbol of someone going like this. And I went, yes, I like that. It adds a visual. Number three, it had a padded handle, thereby sparing my hand. Number four, it was big and broad. We caution parents, you don't use anything that could cause real harm. No belts, which buckles can fly and hit you in the eye. No, if you live in the southeast, there's switches, where you go cut a stick off a willow tree and you use it, no switches, no belts, nothing that could cause real harm or damage. A paddle is broad and it stings, but it does no permanent damage. So having picked this thing out, and we named it the Spanker, Mr. Spanker. Another great thing about an implement is you can put it in a place that makes it inconvenient for you, the parent, to get to. So we kept the Spanker up in our, we have an upstairs laundry room. In the time it took me to get up and go get this Spanker, I could check myself and say, all right, are you angry? Are you going to really let loose on this kid? Are you doing this for the right reasons? It gave me time to review to myself all those. So that's why we believe in an implement and not a hand. The most compelling reason is it's hard to have an impact with older kids with a hand. It just doesn't do the same job. So what we tell parents is having one of these done, if a kid's done one of these Ds, you go get the Spanker, and we're going to get in 3 licks. Now, I don't believe that's an original idea of ours. There's Dr. Dobson, came up with the 2 smacks max principle. We have expanded it to 3. I don't know why. So we tell parents to tell their kids, we're going to get in 3 licks with this paddle when you've done one of these Ds. Now, you might as well, if you're fighting me and I clip your hand, I'm going to blame that on you, not me. So you might as well, as far as you can, comply with this punishment. We're going to get 3 spanks in. Now, what happens after that? A lot of parents are under the mistaken impression that you must now, to let the child know that you still love him or her, turn him around and say, honey, we do this because we love you. It hurt me more than it does you, which is baloney. They see right through that. No, if you do the consoling, loving thing immediately after spanking, what have you done? You've erased what just happened. So what we advocate is we're going to get in these 3 smacks. Now you're going to go to timeout. Why? Timeout puts a kid in the position of getting control of himself. Now what you have to do is be very explicit about the terms of timeout. Because what parents will do will say, now you've gotten your spankings, now you go to your room until you're ready to talk about this. Or until you're ready to have a happy heart. Or until you're ready to be good. They give these vague parameters. Well, if you do that, the kid's going to take 2 steps and turn around and go, okay, I have a happy heart now. No, you don't. You still have snot and tears, So the purpose of timeout is to give them time to get control of themselves. Now, once again, you have to be explicit. We use the 1 minute per year of age rule. So if a kid's 6, you're going to go into timeout for 6 minutes. Now, during that 6 minutes, and we've encouraged parents to use timers, so that your child knows how long that 6 minutes is and isn't constantly yelling, has it been 6 minutes yet? Is it 6 minutes now? No, it's when that clock, During that 6 minutes, your child is welcome to trash his room, provided he understands that whatever you break, we're not going to replace. You're on your own, kid. Break your Legos, you won't get any more Legos. Break your video game, you won't get any more, all right? So you can trash, you can yell all you want. At the end of 6 minutes, I'm going to come up to your room, and if you're still doing that, it's another 6 minutes. We call this a fixed interval ratio of reinforcement. So it's to put the onus on the child to get control of himself. All right, you're still being that way. You got another 6 minutes. At the end of one of those 6-minute periods, if he or she is calm, then you do the debriefing. And it'll go something like this. Do you know why you got the spanking? No. It's because you were disobedient. Do you remember what that is? No. It's whenever you don't do what we tell you to do the first time. You're going to have to repeat this 9 million times, all right? Then you're going to have, if you have an intelligent child, then the little lawyer is going to come out. Well, I didn't hear you. Well, that's why we gave you this spanking, to encourage you to listen more carefully next time. So we take no lawyerly excuses. He can be a lawyer on his own money when he grows up. So then, when that's all done, then you do the, we love you, you know, I'm not just making this up, God gives me the authority, you know, we love you, we're doing this to help you, like that. Now it's over. That's one of the beauties of spanking. Now, I hear parents all the time say, well, we do that, and then he just goes back to the same behavior. Well, then you do the same thing again. Now, there will be days where you will feel like you did nothing but beat this child all day. There were days when Mary and I, alleged experts in child psychology, went to bed and sat up thinking all we did was beat that child today. That's all we did, one after another. How have we psychologically scarred this child today? We can now tell you retrospectively, we have great kids, self-disciplined kids, all of whom are disciples. Not that we're taking any credit for that. I'm just saying it doesn't, you know, you're not scarring your kids to do a biblical, appropriate punishment several times in a day. Now, we learn that any organism, once faced with the undeniable fact that they will be punished every time for this offense, eventually it will go away. Consistency is a problem, because I've got a lot of parents that say, you know, we tried that and it didn't work. We just kept spanking them. And, you know, so I said, what did you do? Well, we stopped doing that and we moved to some other punishment. If you do that, you're just teaching that child that if they act like this punishment means nothing to them, you will give up. So I don't care if he laughs in your face when you spank him. You have to show him that there's a cost to be paid every time he does this offense. Now later, you can alternate that with rewards. We have parents set up a reward system where we say, okay, once you're convinced you're going to get spanked every time for these 3 Ds, we're going to put up a calendar on the fridge. Every day you go without a spanking, I'm going to put a smiley. At the end of the week, if you don't expect perfect, you know, if you have 5 out of 7 smileys, we will go out for ice cream. We'll go get a movie. We'll go do something fun. Now you can start rewarding instead of punishing. Now, when we usually get asked, when do you start and stop corporal punishment? When we say, whenever a kid is exhibiting willful disobedience, that's when you can start. Now, we have grandchildren. We've got 2 existing grandchildren, 1 on the way. Our 2 grandchildren are both under a year and a half old. Already, at their tender little ages, you can see it. When you say, Charlie, don't touch that. Charlie, don't touch that. That's willful disobedience. That's when we can start. Now, he's too young to understand disobedience, disrespect, but he does understand getting a spanking and a firm tone of voice. So that's when you begin, when a child is capable of willful disobedience. When do you stop? There's no hard and fast rule here, but there is clearly a time, one, when it's inappropriate, especially for dads to spank girls. And I figure you will come to that, you'll figure that one out for yourself when that is. So it's when it becomes clearly inappropriate from that kind of standpoint, or when kids start valuing something more than their own physical safety. There came a time in each of our kids' lives where they would gladly put up with a spanking to have what they want. But if you took away their video game, cell phone, or TV, they would act like you deprived them of oxygen. So there comes a time where you can clearly see this isn't the thing anymore. So I think you know that, and that's kind of up to the judgment of the parent. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Mary while I think of about 12 more things I need to tell you that I forgot. But here she is.
You know, I wanted to go back to this research, why the research on spanking is so confusing. And one of the reasons is there is a professor of sociology at the University of New Hampshire who's kind of the biggest opponent of spanking, and he and his team have done a lot of this research, and I've actually read his book. And that he does not see his life's work is to get rid of any kind of corporal punishment in any setting, in prisons, in schools, or in the home. That's his life's work. And he does not distinguish between a judicious spanking, what we would consider a judicious spanking, and abuse. There is no, because he doesn't see a distinction between those things. And so when you're reading the research, all of that is lumped in together. So it's very frightening. I mean, I've read his book, and it's very frightening. I understand why parents are hesitant after seeing some of this. But there's no distinction between a pre-agreed upon punishment of spanking that's not abusive and abuse, because he really doesn't consider those two different things. Now, let me give you some warnings about the use of corporal punishment in your home. I just looked this up before we came, as of 2016, 51 countries around the world have outlawed the use of corporal punishment in the home. So if you are an international student, you need to get online and look and see what the current laws in your country are, okay? We actually were doing a parenting workshop in one of the Caribbean countries, and their country had outlawed spanking for a period of time, I think it was about 5 or 6 years, and then reversed the outlaw of the spanking, that spanking was allowed again. And we were talking to the disciples about this, and the disciples didn't know that it was ever outlawed in their country. So you've got to keep yourself aware of what the current laws in your country are to protect yourself and your children. Currently in the United States, none of the 50 states in the United States has made the use of corporal punishment in the home illegal. However, some states are much more aggressive at prosecuting things like corporal punishment in the home than other states. Where we are in the state of Georgia in the southeast, I mean, spanking is pretty much expected. It's pretty much expected that parents are going to spank their children. We've been in some of the northeastern states, which again is where this professor is doing a lot of his work. It's being litigated much more up there. So you've got to kind of get a feel for where you are locally and how things are being handled. A lot of the states seem to be, Canada allows corporal punishment in the home, but they put restrictions on it. And the restrictions are that you cannot use an implement, which some states consider that more abusive than using your hand. And it can only be applied between the ages of 2 and 12. And so it seems like some of the states are kind of moving in that direction of allowing corporal punishment but putting restrictions on it. So again, you've got to make yourself aware of what your local laws say as far as using corporal punishment. The other thing that you need to know, at least in the United States, is teachers and daycare workers and medical personnel and policemen, legal personnel are what are called mandated reporters. And that means if they have any suspicion that a child is being abused, if a child comes in with a mark or a child comes in saying, "Daddy spanked me last night," they are required by law to report that to Child Protective Services. And we've had this happen to a number of families in our congregations, where they have been reported for spanking a child. Now, I will say, 99% of the time when the child protective people come and investigate and find out that all you are doing is applying a judicious spanking, they're not interested in that. What they're looking for is abuse, most of them. What they are looking for is to outlaw abuse in the home. So they, they're going to investigate it and close the case 90% of the time. But it's still terrifying. It's still a terrible thing to have to go through. We actually have a sister in our congregation who is an attorney for Child Protective Services, and we met with her to make sure that what we were teaching in these classes was what was actually going on. And she reinforced, we're not out to keep parents from punishing their children appropriately. We are out to stop abuse. That's what we're trying to do. But a couple of things that she told us that was very interesting is she said some parents, because they're concerned about this whole spanking thing, have started using other forms of physical punishment in their homes, like making their kids run laps in hot weather or making their kids hold heavy objects above their head, to try to avoid spanking. And those are actually being prosecuted under the label of bizarre discipline as abuse cases. And she said we're seeing more and more of that because parents are afraid to spank. They're using these other forms of discipline. The point is, if you're a Christian parent, you don't want to come close to anything that is like abuse to your child. You don't. You want to discipline your child, but we should never get close to anything that's abusive with our children. If for some reason you think as a parent that you cannot use corporal punishment without being abusive, do not do it. Find another way to discipline your children. What the Bible commands us to do is to discipline our children. That's what it commands. So we have a lot of parents, who were physically abused growing up. And they say, I don't think I can spank my child and not go to that extent. Then you don't spank, all right? Then you get really good at one of these other forms of discipline we're about to talk about. So if for any reason you are concerned that it may go into abuse, do not do it. So let's talk about some other forms of discipline that don't involve corporal punishment. Michael mentioned timeouts, and he kind of gave the rules for that, 1 minute per age of the child. What you're trying to do is get the child to get themselves under control in timeout. That's what you're trying to do, is for them to get whatever behavior you put them in, therefore not to do it anymore. Timeout is a very effective technique, but the fact is it is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do. What timeout actually means is timeout from any type of reinforcement, which means you're trying to put the child in an environment that's very boring to them. That's what's negative about timeout, is it's boring, okay? Now, you can do this. We used to work in a freestanding psychiatric hospital. In a psychiatric unit, you can design a timeout space that's pretty boring. You have that kind of control. In your home, you usually don't, all right? There's always something going on in your home. And some kids are very creative. They will play with the lint on the bottom of their sock and make an animal out of it, and timeout is not that big a deal, So what you have to do is you do the best you can in the home. You try to find a place where the child is outside of the family activities, all right, where it's relatively boring and where they don't want to be for very long. That's the point for timeout. In our house we have stairways that go into an entryway, and there's nothing in the entryway but a big clock and a desk. So it's pretty boring to sit on the bottom step for 7 or 8 minutes, and wait while you could hear the family having fun in the other room. So that's what you're trying to do with timeout. As Michael said, if the time for timeout is over and that child is still not in control, they have to stay there until they get themselves in control. Or you use another form of punishment, like loss of privileges or something, to address that behavior. Let's talk about room restriction. Room restriction is a form of timeout that you can use for older children. Timeout is good for kids. You can start trying to train them with at about 2, and it goes to about maybe 6 or 7. You can do timeout. After that, you can use room restriction with older kids. And that is, you're sent to your room until you get yourself under control again. All right? You're separated from the family activities until you get yourself under control. Now, here's the warning on room restriction. If your child has a flat screen TV and a pool table and a swim-up bar in their room, it's not a punishment. All right? So you've got to kind of design the room so that it's a punishment to be set there. Some kids, just being separated from the family activity is punishment enough. Our oldest daughter, as I told you, she's very social. She loves to have people around her all the time. She hated room restriction. It was by far the most effective thing to do with her. She would actually stay in her room but lay her head out in the hallways where she could still hear the family, what was going on in the family, because she hated being separated from the activity that was going on. So with some kids, this is the punishment of choice, is room restriction. Again, they have to get themselves under control and change the behavior, the inappropriate behavior, before they're allowed to join the family again. It's great for things like fighting with your siblings, whining, things like that, those kind of behaviors. The next one is loss of privileges. If your kids you've got two kids and they're fighting over a toy, the most natural consequence is, okay, I'm going to take that toy and I'm going to put it on the refrigerator, and tomorrow we'll try playing with that toy and sharing it again. So you lose that toy for today. We'll try tomorrow and see if you guys can get along better, Or, you were mean to the neighbors outside when you were playing with them, so you're not allowed to go in the yard for the next couple of days. And in 3 days, we'll try it again and see if you can be nicer to the other kids in the neighborhood. So loss of privileges a lot of time is a very natural consequence for kids. Well, as Michael mentioned, we love taking away electronics, cell phones, tablets, television, computers. We love taking those away because don't tell them, but it's actually good for the kids to be away from those things for a little bit, but they hate it. All right, so that's a great punishment these days. For teenagers, loss of privileges is the punishment of choice. You take away their cell phone, you take away their car keys, you take away the privilege of going with their friends on whatever the weekend activity is. That's the punishment of choice for teenagers. For older kids, you can also have them work off an offense. If you owe me for whatever, let me give you some chores and you can work this off. Some kids will do that with you, so that might be something you can use with older kids.
All right, so whatever you do, if we're going to do corporal punishment, and once again, Mary said, as Mary mentioned, we have some parents that say, I don't care what you say. I'm never going to do this, so fine. We work on some of the other things. They're harder to do because, like I said, they're not immediate, and sometimes they're not as impactful. But if you're going to do the corporal punishment, the 2 keys to success are consistency, number 1. Once again, as I said, the problem is that parents say, I tried it, it didn't seem to work, so I gave up and I tried something else. Like I said, this is what I tell parents. If you're ready to do this, if you're willing to do this and do it just the way we're talking about with the 3 Ds, this is what's going to happen. If you've never done this before, your child is going to test the limits by getting worse. So once you start spanking, for a while they're going to get worse. They want to know, are you serious about this? And they're going to try to test the limits. So you're in for a tough time, but you have got to be consistent. None of this, especially dads, I work with dads a lot, and I say, look, the worst thing you can do is you get home and you get in that chair and someone does a spankable offense and you go, all right, I'm getting the spanker, right? I'm getting up right now, here I go. And then finally the kid runs to do the thing and you went, all right, okay, next time. Let's get, that's the worst thing you can do, You have to be consistent. You have to do this every time, or it means nothing. Kids have amazing inconsistency radar and will know what they can get away with. So consistency. The next thing is specificity. Once again, if you leave we'll talk about this more with teenagers. If you leave any room for lawyerly behavior, they will, so we've got to make it absolutely clear what the offense is we're talking about, give it a name, and be very explicit, as God did in Leviticus 26, about what these punishments and rewards are going to be. If you leave any wiggle room or anything vague, a child will seize on this and use it. So specificity and then persistence. Don't give up. Don't move from thing to thing, which only teaches the child that you're not serious about it, and if they wear you out. Let me say one more thing about, we'll talk about that more with teenagers. So the keys to success: consistency, specificity, and persistence. Now, in graduate school, we learned that rats and pigeons, if you go back to that chart, negative and positive reinforcement, if you apply something like that consistently, they will test the limits, and suddenly, if you're absolutely consistent, the behavior will drop off. So I try to encourage parents and assure them, God wants you, this is good. I remember the other issue. One last thing. Parents' biggest objection, one of their biggest objections to corporal punishment is, if we spank, aren't we teaching them just to be violent? Aren't we teaching them to be aggressive? Look, kids know the difference between an aggressive, impulsive, abusive act, which is what gives corporal punishment a bad name in this country. It's the parents that get louder and louder and escalate. I told you to do this, and then they get up and then they beat the child out of anger. A kid knows the difference between that and a prearranged program that you discussed to begin with, judicious program of spanking, where you tell them from the outset, we're doing this out of love, we have God's model for it, we'll always love you, this is exactly what's going to happen, now it's up to you. Kids, believe me, we see them in the office all the time. They understand the difference between an impulsive act of violence, which you're just, yes, making them more prone to impulsive acts of violence, and what we've talked about here. So we want you to be courageous. We want parents to be courageous about doing this within the restrictions of the laws of the land and within the restrictions of what God says about unconditional love and compassion. Thank you. One more class to go, but let's take 5 minutes. That's 36 out of 40 minutes.